How is everybody today? We've been talking about Christian anthropology, which is basically the doctrine of what a human being is from the perspective of Christianity, and that has to do with two basic questions that we're dealing with. It has to do with almost every ethical question, but two basic questions having to do with the beginning of life and the end of life. In the beginning of life, of course, one of the basic ethical questions that is being discussed all over the world is the question of the right to life of fetuses, or whether that is a meaningful expression. Sometimes the debate throws words around like, are you anti-abortion, are you pro-abortion, are you pro-life, are you anti-life? And of course, those generally have are of no help in discussing the issue. But at the same time, one of the things that one of the points that Banner makes in his book, Christian Ethics and Contemporary Moral Problems, is that the Christian perspective, that is the perspective that has been the general perspective of Christians over the centuries, and has remained the same, basically, up until recent times, is not really based on these scientific or even philosophical discussions. And so, to a certain extent, when Christians get involved in these discussions, they're getting involved in from the perspective of Christian ethics, are basically irrelevant questions. But since they are part of the discussion in the public sphere, Christians can't just completely consider them to be irrelevant. But Christians need to understand that the Christian perspective existed before the modern concern about population, before the modern concern about the educational and convenience and the social welfare of young mothers who get pregnant. In other words, all of these concerns have been recently heightened, so that the practice of abortion has developed in Europe and in America, even in countries which generally have considered themselves to have a Jewish Christian background. The practice of abortion has developed alongside of any discussion, and actually, in a sense, not really tied to any discussion about the theological meaning of abortion. In other words, we're going to do what we want to do, and we're actually doing what we want to do, and it usually has nothing to do with any particular argument. Even the Supreme Court decision of 1973, Roe versus Wade, wasn't really made on the basis of any particular argument. Basically, what the Roe versus Wade decision did was simply decide not to decide. In other words, to allow individuals in American society, along with discussions with their own doctor or discussions with nobody. Basically, what the law says is that the Constitution protects the right of American citizens to make that decision without any interference from the government. Well, then the only argument upon which the Supreme Court decision was based was a constitutional argument. And we can continue to debate the constitutional argument, but it really has nothing to do with the other arguments that are thrown around in our culture about how the woman should have control of her own body, and that a woman should have final say in the exercising of her own views about having children and so forth. These all may be great arguments, but they have nothing to do particularly with the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court decision basically was simply hands off. government hands off of the issue. So the issue is still out there. In fact, I heard a recording of the debate at the Supreme Court of Roe versus Wade, and it was an incredibly surprising debate to me, because the woman who had brought, or the lawyer who had brought Roe versus Wade to the Supreme Court, really didn't have to make a very substantial argument. And one of the reasons why she didn't is because the attorney, the state attorney that was defending the Texas law concerning abortion, had nothing from which to argue himself. He just didn't make an argument. He just filled in the time. And so basically what had to happen was the Supreme Court justices, based on just a few minutes of argument, had to decide an issue which has had tremendous implications since 1973. There have now been millions of fetuses aborted, and that decision was not based on any moral or ethical criteria. That decision was based on the Supreme Court's decision not to decide any moral or ethical criteria in that particular instance. In other words, our practice in America and England and other places simply means we are practicing what a significant portion of American society wants to practice. And so there really hasn't been that much discussion about the ethical or moral implications of it. There has simply been discussion about what a certain group of people in America want. They want the right to choose, as they say. Now, of course, the problem is everybody wants the right to choose. The question is, what are you choosing? And that discussion is generally simply put off, because the assumption is that every individual has the right to the control of his or her own body. Every woman has the right to determine when and where and under what circumstances she's going to have a child. And so whatever intervenes in the midst, in the middle of that situation, even if it's a pregnancy, is not really a part of the public discussion. The only thing right now that's really a part of the public discussion is the woman's right to choose to terminate her pregnancy a constitutional right. That is something that's protected by the Constitution. Now, there's a lot of discussion going on, but the discussion is usually just kind of high-powered rhetoric. People shouting at each other and assuming that the other person is either mentally retarded or socially retarded or ethically retarded or something. And so the bottom line of what I'm saying is that there never really has been a public discussion in America on the ethical issues of abortion. Now, that means that that a great many of the things that have gone on, there has been kind of a discussion of the issue, sometimes in prepared seminars in different places across the country, but and in psychological journals and in theological journals and philosophical journals and political journals. But that discussion really hasn't been laid before the American people in any important way. And so what Banner is saying is that that our practice in this regard, particularly in England and America, which he's most familiar with, our practice in this regard generally really has no relationship to an ethical discussion. And so Christians should not necessarily feel bound to to accept the results of some kind of widespread societal ethical discussion. A Christian should go back to his or her resources, which is Christian theology, the Christian faith, the meaning of Jesus Christ. Christian medical ethics is obliged to begin from its own starting place, taking up its constructive task from its unique and distinctive presupposition, namely the gospel of Jesus Christ. For it is in the light of this gospel of the word spoken to humankind that humankind gains a true self-understanding. Now, the Supreme Court obviously has at least gotten to the point in modern times where it cannot revert back to the gospel. It cannot revert back to the presuppositions upon which Christian ethics must begin. But that doesn't mean that because the Supreme Court and the law of the land cannot revert back to the gospel, that Christians ought to quit doing that, or that Christians ought to just kind of give up the discussion, as if the discussion were already decided. If the goodness of human life includes the goodness of bodily life, and if this body is itself to be caught up in the redemption for which the Christian hopes, then medicine is permitted, vindicated, and honored. We find, however, that medicine refuses this calling either by withdrawing altogether from the service of the body or by converting service into manipulation. The charge that by its complicity with the practice of abortion, medicine is involved in a repudiation of the goodness of human life could, of course, be rebutted if two things were to be shown. Both that the fetus is not to be regarded as sharing in human life, and in addition that medical practice is actually based on a belief that fetus does not share in human life. That's just an issue that's not discussed in the Supreme Court case. That's an issue that's certainly not discussed in the Constitution. And in positive law, sometimes the Constitution has had over the years to be interpreted. For instance, up until the Constitution was amended to reflect the fact black people were not considered to be fully human beings. Well, that was an issue that was discussed before that amendment was passed, but that is not an issue that has been discussed as yet in terms of the abortion issue. It's been discussed kind of informally, but it's never been discussed seriously in terms of the constitutional issues. And so the assumption of our practice and the assumption of our present law is that the fetus does not share in human life, at least to the extent that it should share in the protection that other human life shares under our American system. And that may be true. It may be that the fetus does not share in human life in a significant enough way for it to be protected. But that's not just self-evident. And so what we're operating under now in the United States is basically a laissez-faire conclusion. In other words, the issue is such a hot issue, it's such a disputed issue, that the Supreme Court felt like it could neither decide the issue philosophically in favor of pro-abortion, nor could it decide the issue legally in favor of the anti-abortion people. So basically it simply turned the matter over to us as private citizens for our own decision. Now, that still leaves some problems out in the states, because the states still have some laws respecting abortion that don't necessarily have to do with whether an abortion can be legal or not, But they have to do, for instance, with whether it is legitimate for a state to require the parents, for instance, of an underage child to be notified that their child is going to get an abortion, or that the father of the fetus that is going to be aborted has the right to be notified, or if the state has the right to expect a kind of a cooling off period to give everybody involved the possibility of thinking the issue through and trying to decide really what they want to do. And those kind of laws are still perking up to the Supreme Court every once in a while. And it still appears as though the states have some right in making laws respecting these kinds of things. But generally, that's up to the state. And so on these kind of laws, there will be different laws in each state. So basically what the Supreme Court decision has done is not to decide what laws can surround the issue of abortion, giving rights to parents or giving rights to the father. What the Supreme Court has done basically is decided not to decide the issue whether it can interfere with the decision of the mother. And it has decided it cannot interfere with that decision, at least up to a certain point. Now, all of the other discussion, for instance, about what's the difference in a fetus 3 days or in a fetus 3 days after it is after the egg is inseminated, or what is the difference between a fetus at the end of 14 days. In England, for instance, it is illegal to experiment on a fetus after it's 14 days old. It's not illegal to go in and terminate it, but it's illegal to experiment on it. Well, that's an interesting kind of juxtaposition of ideas. What is the basis of that? What is the basis of deciding when it is not any longer legal to abort a fetus? The term viability arises. Well, what is viability? And does viability actually change the nature of the fetus? Or is the fetus sentient? In other words, does the fetus have the possibility of thinking or feeling pain? And sometimes that is put forward as if that is a very important issue. Well, these are issues that can be arbitrarily decided upon, I suppose, by the Supreme Court or by any legislature. But those don't necessarily have any relevance to the Christian understanding of abortion, or the Christian understanding of the termination of pregnancy, or the Christian understanding of the status of the fetus, or the Christian understanding of the rights of the fetus. Because the Christian understanding of the status of the fetus does not necessarily ever have to coincide with the state's definition or arbitrary definition of the status of the fetus. When, however, we look for an argument which might support the basic contention about the fetus and has in addition been important to medical practice, we shall be struck by the fact, as J.T. Noonan, more than 25 years ago, he wrote a tremendous book. It's actually kind of a classic book called Contraception, which deals with the whole history of contraception and abortion in the Christian faith from the very beginning. I don't know whether that book is still in print, but if you ever run across it, that's one of those classics that you need for your library on ethics if you want to have one. But anyway, he says that there is in public discussion a distinct indifference to fundamental questions of this sort. That's what I was trying to say by the fact that what's happening in America is simply that we are practicing something because a certain number of people want it to be practiced this way, and they want their right to practice it protected by the Constitution. And basically what the Supreme Court has done is go along with this petition. But the public discussion has really not taken into consideration or taken seriously, in fact, as Noonan says, is indifferent to fundamental questions about the status of the fetus. Insofar as defenses of abortion rely on anthropologies which claim that bodily life is not, as such, worthy of respect, they rely on anthropologies inconsistent with a Christian understanding of creation. There are a great many religious and philosophical perspectives in the history of the world in which bodily life is not, as such, worthy of respect. And some of those perspectives have been predominant in some countries in the world, even in Europe, in the 20th century, for instance, in Nazi Germany. And Christianity has to conceive of any perspective that considers bodily life not worthy of respect to be inconsistent with the Christian faith. The Christian faith is based on the Jewish conception of creation. The Jewish conception of creation is that everything that God created is good. God intended creation. It's His idea. He doesn't consider it a bad idea. He considers it a good idea, and He has blessed it, and He calls it good, according to the biblical perspective. That includes the creation of human life. It includes the creation of animal life. It includes the creation of non-living life, non-living reality. I guess there's no such thing as non-living life, but non-living reality. From the biblical perspective, all of this is the creation of God, and therefore all of this deserves some sort of respect. Now, as you go into a discussion of how human life should be respected in comparison with animal life, or how animal life should be respected in comparison to non-animal life, or to the environment, or just to the material universe, you're going to get into different discussions about how those things should work themselves out. But generally, Christian thought has had such a positive conception of bodily life that it has considered it to be normally illegitimate because of the nature and intention of God. It's been considered illegitimate to deliberately take life from the beginning. In the Bible, for instance, the first chapters of the Bible begins with the problematic discussion of the taking of human life in the case of Cain and Abel. In the discussion of the new covenant that was made with Noah, one of the principal contingencies on that covenant is that human beings should not take other people's lives. Now, if you'll notice in that covenant, it says that a person who takes another person's life has forfeited his own life. So this is a very complicated discussion, and it cannot be put just in terms of right to life or the absolute sanctity of human life. Because in Christianity, there is no such thing as the absolute sanctity of human life. Human life does not belong to human beings. It belongs to God. But sometimes human beings can actually make a decision. This is what Christianity has always believed. Human beings can actually sometimes make a decision in which they forfeit their own life. For instance, in defense of someone else, or even in martyrdom. Now, Christianity does not promote martyrdom. In other words, a Christian is not supposed to go out and seek martyrdom. There are some kinds of ideas of martyrdom in the modern world in which a person actually straps a bomb around his waist and goes into a grocery store and blows everybody up. And that's sometimes called martyrdom, but that may be martyrdom with respect to certain understandings of human nature, but that's not martyrdom in the Christian understanding. In the Christian understanding, martyrdom may be preferable to living. So there's not a kind of philosophical principle of the absolute sanctity of biological life. For one thing, biological life is not ultimate in Christian thought. It is what Bonhoeffer called penultimate. Penultimate. That is, that there does come a time, sometimes, when a Christian may make a decision to let his life go. And sometimes may even make a decision which will result in the death of someone else. That's what an ethical decision is all about. So in principle, there is no Christian prohibition absolutely to protect all life absolutely. But there is generally in Christianity an assumption that life is good because it's the gift of God and it should be protected unless there is some kind of overwhelming prejudice against protecting it, or some kind of overwhelming consideration against protecting it. In the gospel, and perhaps only in the gospel, that can be argued, we find sure grounds for the repudiation of these alternative anthropologies, with their competing and arbitrary distinctions, and hence for the assertion of the fundamental equality of human beings. Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, made a statement which we all like. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We like that. Sometimes we don't consider why he made that statement, or what is the philosophical or historical situation out of which he could make that statement. Since, as far as we can tell, it is not self-evident. If it was self-evident, then most people in the history of the world would have agreed with it. But it is not self-evident. You have to raise people's consciousness to the idea that all human beings are created equal, and you have to have some basis upon which to make such a startling assertion, because that is a startling assertion in terms of human history. And Jefferson made it on the basis of the fact that he appeared at a particular point in history after there had been a long history of Jewish and Christian infiltration, so to speak, into human history and into human culture, in which there was a conception of the equality of human life, which is a conception that goes back both to the New Testament and to the Old Testament, that is, the equality of human beings. But we're now painfully aware these days that even Jefferson, if he had in his own mind a consistent concept of the equality of human beings, didn't express it in that statement, because he himself continued to own slaves. And so people are very anxious these days to make that point known, that when Jefferson made the statement, he himself was a sinner, just like everybody else. But the point I'm making is that these statements have their context. They don't just fall out of heaven. And if we want to know why a group of people anywhere in the world, for instance, is involved today, for instance, in headhunting and cutting off people's heads, involved in slave trade, involved possibly in throwing children off the boat just so they won't get arrested, all kinds of things like that that are happening every day in the world, you need to ask a question about what is the status of a human being from the perspective from which these people are acting. And there is no doubt that Christians throughout the centuries have often failed to act as though human beings were equal. They have often failed to act as though human beings are all brothers and sisters. They have often failed to act as if human beings were one race. That is a basic affirmation of the Bible, that human beings are one race. That is not self-evident, as you can tell by the fact that human beings still operate under the assumption that there are a great many races and the difference between these races is morally significant. That is just not on the biblical map. And yet still, for centuries, often Christians have acted as if that human beings are of different races and therefore they have different values. Well, in order to get past that Christian failing, and in order to get past any failing that modern people, Christian or non-Christian, in our society may be involved in, you have to go back, as he says, to some distinctive, fundamental doctrines. Specifically, we now ask of the practice of euthanasia, as of any other human practice, whether or not it is appropriate to the life of those who should live, by the fact that the future is the time of Jesus Christ in redemption, in which our calling to be children and heirs of his Father will be fully manifest. You say, well, that just sounds like a theological statement. Well, of course it is. If you're not going to be a Christian, then you shouldn't deal in theology. If you're not going to be a Jew, then you shouldn't deal in theology. But if you're going to be a Christian, you have to deal in theology. And so what is the basis upon which a Christian might decide the question of euthanasia? Well, it has to be on the basis of what a human being was meant to be and what the destiny of a human being is. And the point Banner wants to make is that euthanasia is based on a particular understanding of the destiny of human beings, which does not take into account that they have a future in Jesus Christ. In the practice of martyrdom, thus elucidated, can be regarded as embodying a practice of dying consistent with the Christian anthropology, a dying which is filled with hope and not fear, but which is suffered rather than sought. That's what I meant by saying that martyrdom is not something that Christians go out and look for. They don't apply for martyrdom. How shall we assess many of the dyings accomplished under the rule of contemporary medicine or under the rule of medicine as some would like it to be? Does medicine allow for or encouraging a dying in which we may be said with our last breaths to breathe in the atmosphere of redemption? Or, as Banner might put it, are we just breathing in death? In other words, are we just acquiescing to death? Or is its practice comprehensible only as founded on an anthropology which knows nothing of such a future? How a person dies depends upon how they understand who they are, how they understand their relation to God, how they understand their future in relation to God. If your anthropology contains no future in relation to God, then perhaps euthanasia is a good option. If you are suicide, maybe even is a good option. But if you have some concept that you and your body do not belong to yourself, they belong to God, and they've been created for a purpose, and they've been created for a certain destiny, then maybe you should think about it before you agree to euthanasia or before you agree to suicide. That maybe you don't have the right, theologically and spiritually speaking, to get involved in either of these. We shall allege that euthanasia is a practice in which medicine turns its back, not only on the created goodness of human life, but also on the goodness of its redeemed future. We shall further allege that euthanasia is a practice in which medicine turns its back not only on the created goodness of human life, but also on the goodness of its redeemed future. Now, this also has some relationship has relationship to the question of abortion. One of the discussions that has gone on, where discussion has gone on, has to do with whether the fetus is a human life or whether it is a potential human life. And sometimes it is argued, if it were a human life, then of course the practice in the United States would not be justified. But if it is only a potential human life, then that practice may be justified. On the other hand, the people who argue that it is a potential human life say that on the basis of the fact that it is a potential human life, then it must be treated as the same way as a human life is. So what people are doing is just sitting and throwing philosophical principles at each other. We might as well throw in a theological principle, and that's the principle of eschatology, or the principle of destiny. From the Christian perspective, not only is the fetus not fully human, but you, even if you're 35, 36, 50, or 60 years old, are not yet fully human. God still has something in mind for you, in store for you, and so the particular date upon which you appear on that journey is not all that relevant. That's the reason why sometimes when Christians who know something about the Bible argue against abortion, they say things like, not only is human life valuable after inception, human life is actually valuable before conception. There are several times in which the Bible talks about something like, before you were conceived, I knew you. Well, you see, that's an eschatological idea. That's not a scientific idea. So the Supreme Court can't decide on what date you were conceived and therefore decide what your value is in the eyes of God. Because who decides what your value is in the eyes of God? God decides that. So before you were conceived, I knew you and I loved you. Well, that is a very affirmative conception of the goodness of bodily life and of individual human existence. That's not just based on sperm and egg. That's not just based on timetable. That's based on what is going on in the mind of God. If you don't believe in God, then don't go there. But if you believe in God, you have to go there. You can't make your decision based on a particular biological timetable. You can only make your decision on the basis of what is the purpose for the creation of human life. Is it for purposes of my decision and my manipulation? What is the only, Banner's going to talk about this, but from the perspective of Christian faith, what is the only attitude I can have toward the creation of human life? The only attitude I can have toward it is to welcome it. He's going to go on to say that there may be cultures, and ours may be one of them, in which we have a concept, unwanted children. And that's the basis upon which lots of decisions are made in our culture, whether such and such is an unwanted child. Well, what Banner is saying is there could be a culture, and that's the culture that Christianity aims for. There could be a culture in which there are no such thing as unwanted children. Wouldn't that be interesting? But in our culture, at least at the present time, we assume that there is a category called unwanted children, and therefore we have to decide whether they are protected or not. Unwanted by whom? They're not obviously unwanted by God, or he wouldn't put out the time to create them. They should not be unwanted by Christians, because Christians should be simply in a position of welcoming the gift of God and not making a decision as to whether this gift of God is of any value. So we shall allege that euthanasia is a practice in which medicine turns its back not only on the created goodness of human life, but also on the goodness of its redeemed future. And you might just put the word abortion in that same sentence. What is the goodness of the redeemed future of human life? Whether the person is 75 or 80 years old, or whether the person is a 6 or 8 week old fetus, what is the future of its redeemed life? We shall further allege that this practice commends itself to its modern advocates principally as a more rational response to the hopelessness of the human predicament than the practices of neglect and overtreatment. In other words, people who are especially in favor of euthanasia these days can cite some very good facts. I mean, not good facts, but can cite some facts that lend support to the idea of euthanasia. One is that human beings at certain points in their life, namely at this point of extremis, are often neglected. For instance, lots of people who are dying are neglected in that evidently practitioners of medicine, being human beings just like everybody else, kind of withdraw in the face of death. And one of the problems that's just now being recognized and dealt with is that a lot of practitioners of medicine would not allow some people to be adequately treated with pain relief, of all things, because they didn't want them to be addicted. Here you have somebody that's got a few weeks to live, and pain relief, adequate pain relief, is not recommended. In fact, a great many medical practitioners up until recently have not even had an education in adequate pain relief. Their whole purpose, of course, is to save life and to try to protect life. And so they haven't, in order to do that, they focus on the saving of life, and when the time comes when life can no longer be saved, they sometimes are not focused on that person anymore. And so euthanasia becomes kind of a way out. That certainly is preferable to neglect. And it's also possibly preferable to overtreatment. So there are practices which actually raise the question of euthanasia and make it a palatable and even a compassionate option. Yes? Yes, push the button.
Okay. But, I mean, maybe the question shouldn't be euthanasia. It should be like, does our healthcare system suck? And I just think also it's because, like, gee, why are the doctors atheists? You know, because a lot of them aren't Christians, so how can you even approach it with a Christian ethic if your doctor is not Christian? So
well,
it's like, you know.
You can't expect a doctor who's not Christian necessarily to approach it from a Christian ethic. But you certainly should expect Christians to approach it from a Christian ethic. But Christians can also, or Jews or any other people who have a similar view of life and the future of God, can contribute to the discussion by bringing out some of these points. For instance, I personally have experienced the situation in my own family where a person went to the hospital for the last time. And all of us probably knew this person was going to the hospital for the last time. And so for a little while, as long as the insurance was still available, she was taken care of meticulously. But the time came in which the insurance company kept saying, well, now she's been in there too long. You can't save her, so she needs to go. And so that's when the treatment just kind of faded. And so this was my grandmother, and she died in tremendous pain. Tremendous pain. Well, we knew she was going to die, but what we couldn't understand is why she had to die in such tremendous pain. So these issues need to be raised, and they need to be dealt with. But there are ways of helping people to live out their lives, their natural lives, in a comfortable way that might precede the act of euthanasia. And we just need to raise our consciousnesses about these kinds of things. The advocates of voluntary euthanasia know that the approach to death which they recommend, that is, the killing of a patient, whether by act or omission, on that patient's request, has the advantage over neglect and over treatment. In this respect, at least, that it does not avoid or ignore or deny the fact of death. Euthanasia does not ignore or deny the fact of death, whereas overtreatment and neglect sometimes is simply an expression of our human tendency, even medical practitioners, to deny or to ignore the act of death. In other words, to just kind of withdraw and become alienated from the patient. Yes?
And what she was saying, you know, how she was like, well, are the doctors atheists? But what if the doctors aren't atheists and they, you know, they feel that if the person was to live, they have a poor quality of life. So in that sense, they're kind of helping you, you know, to see that this person isn't going to live a fulfilling life, and so it's better to just put them out of their misery now instead of keeping them on.
Well, of course, it is. It's often put in terms of an act of compassion, and you shouldn't take that away from anybody, whether they're religious or non-religious. The fact that they have compassion, but why I'm saying, and what Banner is saying, is that that sometimes we make our own judgment as to the value of a continuing life. In such a way as to take away the dignity of a human being. There are situations in which it is not good to prolong human life. And therefore there are situations in which all, even religious people, assume that, for instance, what is called extraordinary measures are not necessarily required by the dignity of human life. In fact, extraordinary measures may actually be an assault on the dignity of human life. But when it gets down to making the judgment as a human being, not to allow somebody to die, but to actually kill somebody, that's what euthanasia is. Allowing somebody to die is not euthanasia. Actually deciding to kill somebody is euthanasia. And quite often, that is based on the exigencies of a particular moment in which the dignity of a person actually suffering death or going through death is not considered of any value. Using their medical skills in the service of the patient. So advocates of euthanasia will say, doctors should assist the patient in ending a life which has reached its conclusion in a way which will be painless, planned, and dignified. As should be obvious, however, this case for euthanasia relies on a false dilemma, as if the choice which is presented to us is exhaustively one between a good death, as the advocates of euthanasia understands it, and that's what the word euthanasia means, it's good death, and the bad death of neglect or overtreatment. What Banner is saying is those are not the only alternatives. so vividly portrayed in the cases which are the stuff of the propaganda for euthanasia. The practice of euthanasia, while it must be distinguished from the practices of neglect and overtreatment, shares with these practices the fact that it is enthralled by death, for it disdains the avoidance of the reality of death. Still, it is to be understood, like the avoidance, as a practice which is itself determined by the fear of this reality. The gospel, however, addresses us with an imperious fear not. We are to defy death, certainly, but not simply with a scorn which robs the victor of some pleasure in his victory. Our defiance is not a defiance which aims to surmount our fate, but a moment of human assertion, a defiance which celebrates our ultimate release from this fate, in the fact that beyond the antithesis of being and non-being, beyond all dialectic, it is true in Jesus Christ that God is our Father and we are His children. And now again, back to theological language. Now, we need to understand that Banner is not throwing scorn on arguments for euthanasia. He's just trying to elicit or to try to tease out of arguments for euthanasia exactly what they are. And if they are actually in terms of the value of human life and human existence, as appropriate as they are sometimes said to be. You wanted to say something?
With David Hume's essay on suicide, where he writes that in cheating death, instead of allowing death to have victory over us, it is appropriate to take one's life. Thus, if the end result is that God intends for you to die, helping God by taking your life is in fact justified. So if someone is wanting to commit suicide but yet don't want to do it themselves and they decide to be euthanized, I mean, that within itself is almost the same argument that Hume is presenting. And where does the value of the intrinsic life come from with that type of mindset?
Well, again, you can only answer that from Banner's perspective in terms of Christian theology. In other words, life is in service to God. When I commit suicide, I have decided that I will no longer live in service to God. Now, there are extreme situations in which no ethical considerations are usually considered to be relevant. And Christians need to recognize that. For one reason, Christians need to recognize that because often in Christian history, for instance, suicide has been considered to be a sin. And it's such a sin that even people who've committed suicide have been refused Christian burial. Or at their funerals, it has been announced that since they committed suicide, they're going to hell. Well, I can understand people reacting to that view of suicide because that, at least from my perspective and from Banner's perspective too, is a totally non-Christian or unchristian attitude toward the suicide, toward the person who commits suicide. Christians can no longer judge the eternal fate of people who commit suicide than they can judge the eternal fate of anybody else. But Christians can affirm that unlike the perspective of nihilists and other people who do not believe that people have a future in God, Christians can affirm that suicide is not appropriate for a person who recognizes himself or herself to be the creation of God and to have a future in God. Now, if you are on the verge of suicide, you've probably gotten that far because you have descended into hopelessness. And so if, having descended into hopelessness, you actually choose to kill yourself, that is a tragedy, primarily for the people who are still alive. That's one thing that people who are thinking about committing suicide need to be made aware of. That is, that they think that they are escaping something. And they think they're doing it by a kind of painless way. But what they're doing is making it painless for themselves and utterly painful for everybody else that loves them. Now, obviously, a person who goes ahead and commits suicide, that's not much of a consideration. But what Banner and other people want to say, particularly in terms of people who kind of deliberately and consciously choose suicide, that is, choose to be euthanized, are making this decision kind of while they're at the bottom. And Christians should at least be in a position or be prepared to try to lift people from the bottom. And Christians, of course, do not necessarily have the right to make this decision for everybody. But Christians should consider that they have the right to at least try to lift somebody from the bottom and give them hope and give them some indication of why it might be worthwhile for them to live. You know, it's hard to live, and it's hard for somebody who doesn't have some of these diseases to kind of rhetorize on the question. But on the other hand, it's hard also for a person who has a Christian perspective to simply say, well, it doesn't make any difference. There are lots of people who are in situations where they feel like suicide is the only way out, but who learn by intervention that suicide is not the only way out, and live lives, long lives, of service to God. And that's what Banner is saying. Not that we condemn people who make this choice, or that we condemn people who commit suicide as if they've committed the unpardonable sin, but that Christians stand ready to lift people from the bottom in which they find themselves, and to protect them, and to protect them especially from propagandists who actually reinforce their idea of hopelessness and of no value in life and so forth. Yeah.
As a Christian, in the light of the omniscience and omnipotence of God, could a person ever ethically be able to decide whether or not a life should end, and if so, when that life would end?
Well, it's generally been the Christian perspective that Christians do not have the right to decide that, not only for other people, but even for themselves. And that's a hard sell these days, because I don't know whether you read carefully Banner's quotations from Ingalls, you know, of the famous Marx and Engels comedy team. Ingalls actually provides a couple of paragraphs for Banner, in which Ingalls describes what a laissez-faire capitalism will produce psychologically and sociologically. It will produce a society in which basically the only concern is comfort and convenience. And when your only concern is comfort and convenience, then Engels, who we probably shouldn't necessarily consider to be a Christian theologian, but his analysis and Marx's analysis of some social situations are very Christian, in the sense that they are that they are talking about what happens when you lose, when a society, for instance, loses its sense of community and its sense of solidarity and so forth. And that, to a certain extent, he warns, for instance, against anarchy. And in a sense, that's what some people want, is moral anarchy. That is, the ability for every individual simply to make a decision as though it had no relevance to anybody else. And to a Christian, the biggest sin about suicide is not what it does to the person who commits it, but what it does to everyone else for whom that person is a gift from God and a gift that they don't want to give up. And so people who've had their children or their loved ones commit suicide then will never get over it the rest of their lives. And so if something could have been done to actually give meaning to a life, could have been done to redeem a life, even if it were only for a little while, that gave meaning to other people, then in a sense that's kind of a Christian obligation. It's kind of a Christian obligation for a person not to commit suicide. It's not just a legal thing. It's kind of a Christian obligation. Because I've talked to mothers, some of them have been my students, whose children have committed suicide. And that may have seemed the right thing to do for that person at that particular instant. And it may be that nobody did their duty in trying to intervene and trying to give hope and comfort and support to that person. But now that the suicide has taken place, the pain has really just begun. It's begun for other people. So you've got to consider two things when you're talking about Christian ethics. You've got to consider that the nature of the human being and the nature of the human being's act is rooted in your concept of the character of God. But that is related to the fact that Jewish Christian ethics are social ethics. That is, they're related to the community. That is, to the character of the interrelationship between human beings. And so I have a great deal of sympathy for arguments for euthanasia. They are very sympathetic arguments. And it may be that when I'm ever in a situation where I have something to say about whether somebody participates in euthanasia or not, I don't know exactly what I'll say about it. It's a very complex and heart-rending kind of situation. But on the other hand, euthanasia, even thinking and arguing toward euthanasia, is obviously, as you can see from the Nazi experience, is a slippery slope. That doesn't mean that people now arguing for euthanasia are Nazis or anywhere near Nazis, but it's a slippery slope. I remember reading Aldous Huxley's novel in which he talks about the time coming when somebody who is a certain age, I forget what it was, 60 or 65 or 70, is under legal obligation to present themselves to the euthanasia group, because obviously life is not worth living past 65 or 70, and so what you do is just institutionalize euthanasia. And so the state or somebody else then decides when life is worth living. there was when I was in college, I thought I was going to create a sensation because I predicted the day upon which Bertrand Russell was going to die. Well, people didn't know why in the world I would go around predicting the day Bertrand Russell was going to die, because he was fairly old, but he seemed to be healthy. Well, the reason why I predicted that was because Bertrand Russell, when he was younger, participated in this kind of idea that euthanasia should take place at a certain age. And when he was younger, he predicted that his obituary would appear in the London Times on a certain date. So being a brash young philosophy student who, by the way, at that time I was kind of a disciple of Bertrand Russell, I thought, man, this is wonderful. Bertrand has the courage to die. He has the courage to die on a certain date because he thinks his life won't be of much value from then on. And so I assume that's the reason why he had predicted his obituary would be in the papers, because he planned to die. He planned to commit suicide. Well, Bertrand fouled me up. I'm glad he fouled me up because I didn't want to see Bertrand die that day. But evidently, when Bertrand became 85, he didn't think the same way as he did when he was 40. You know, when you're 40, you still, you know, when you're 40, you kind of think, man, I don't want to live to be 65. You can't have sex after 35. You know, that's the kind of way people look at this. And so in a sense, that is kind of a comical way to say that that making provision for people to commit suicide or to be euthanized at a certain time is actually a declaration of hopelessness about the value of a life beyond a certain point, or the value of a life beyond a certain date. So I didn't become famous for predicting Bertrand Russell's death, because Bertrand Russell actually changed his mind. When he became 85, he realized that there was something to live for. It's hard to tell exactly what all it was that Bertrand Russell wanted to live for, but he certainly wanted to live. And all of us get into situations, some of us deeper than others, in which we say, what is my life worth? What is there about life that I should continue to participate in? I've gotten into that situation a couple of times in my life. It has never gone past just a few seconds, because I immediately recognize that the reason why I'm so in such despair and so hopeless is because I am so worried about my children or somebody else, and they're in bad trouble and I don't know how to help them and so forth. And so it in my experience has immediately turned to an affirmation of the fact that I need to continue to live. I have the obligation to continue to live, even though the pain makes it certainly tempting to ease the pain. What I would be doing is easing my own pain. At the same time, I'm creating more pain than I have ever imagined. And that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that Christians should be in the hospital room making decisions for people. I think the fact of the matter is that the Christian doesn't necessarily belong in anybody else's hospital room, unless he's been invited, unless he's part of the counseling situation. But on the other hand, I think that Christians are under obligation to try to put euthanasia and abortion in a different light. That is, euthanasia and abortion are in a sense based on the hopelessness of the instant and not based on the hope that might be involved in the continuing life and the nature of that continuing life as a gift. That's the reason why, in terms of abortion, I, for instance, find it very depressing to be involved in a discussion of abortion, because I generally, or euthanasia, because I generally dig down for emotional things to say. You understand what I'm saying? Instead of rational things. Because to me it is a very emotional subject because of my own existential experience. It just dawned on me one time, and I don't know if it's dawned on many people or how many people it's dawned on. It just dawned on me one time that I am a survivor of abortion. That is, if anybody in the last 1 million years had decided to abort their child in a certain line, I wouldn't exist. Therefore, I wouldn't even be worried about this discussion. If my great-grandmother, who was never married, had aborted her child, I would not exist. My grandfather would not have existed. My father would not have existed. I would not exist. That seems like a kind of an esoteric consideration, but it's esoteric only to you. It's not esoteric to me, because I am overjoyed that I exist and that I have life and I have the ability to do whatever I am supposed to be doing. And it also is emotional and existential to me because both of my children are adopted. And if the mothers of either one of those children had decided for convenience sake to abort them, then I wouldn't have those children. And you better not mess with my children. They are of tremendous value to me. And so it hurts my brain to think that they may have been aborted for any kind of reason, for convenience or any other kind of reason. And so I wouldn't have my grandchildren. Now you say those are esoteric reasons. Of course they are, except that human existence is a reality which we are deciding when we decide whether to abort or not. And all of the complexity, I consider myself to be a kind of complex and sometimes even valuable person. I know that my children are extremely complex and extremely valuable and extremely loving. And the world would be not better off if they had been aborted. And the same thing for my grandchildren. I just don't believe that the world would be better off if those people were aborted. So when I think about the issue, it's a very emotional thing to me. And I don't understand why it's not an emotional thing in the same way to other people. One of the more interesting groups that I've run into lately is the group called, this relates to some of the present discussion about abortion, is a group called Children of Rape Victims for Life. Now think about that. You know, one of the reasons why people give all the time for abortion is rape. In other words, the assumption is that any time anybody is raped and get pregnant, she should abort. But there is a group in the United States who are actually people who were conceived during a rape. And they are almost, at least this group, is fightingly anti-abortion. And you can't blame them, because they kind of like themselves. They kind of like the fact that they're in existence. Even though they have maybe 2 strikes against them. Maybe their mother did not, was kind of alienated from them. Maybe society was kind of alienated from them. But they still think that they are worth living. And they think that because they think that the status of themselves as a fetus is different from what a lot of people assume. And we will try it again next time.